Hello, Martin va agus fesgyrma fulcha Q Gaelic le Joseph. Gaelic podcast agam is Misha Joseph Ananalaba. Ha podcast agam, my podcast. So hopefully all of the things you've heard so far you've understood. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Joseph and this is my Learning Gaelic YouTube channel. If you're looking for something much faster, then I suggest you go over to Gaelic with Jason, because this YouTube channel is for people who find learning Gaelic a little bit uneasy, maybe people who find learning Gaelic a little bit frightening, because until you know the basics of Gaelic, it can seem very, very alien. So we're spending a lot of time on the basics. We've gone through 10 lessons, we took a little break, and we're just revising those lessons again. Okay, so the lesson you're hearing now will correspond roughly to lesson 2, which you've heard already. Okay, so we're just going to revise that and maybe add a little bit more as well. Okay, so have podcast agam, my podcast. The way we say possession in Gaelic, my things, for example, are not usually with a pronoun like my, okay, or his. We do use those sometimes, but in Gaelic we usually say things are at us. For example, the podcast, at me, my podcast. Ha podcast agam. So literally it means is podcast at me, is the podcast at me. That's literally what it means. But we always put the verb first, but the meaning is the podcast is at me, my podcast. Now, we also can use mo sometimes, for example, and we use that only with things which are very close to us, like family members or body parts. For example, mhac is the word for son, so mo mhac would be my son. And I'm not sure about modern Gaelic and the way people use the language, but I've certainly heard more people using mo for everything rather than trying to work with things which are at them. Historically, and in Gaelic generally, things are at you, and also if you're sick, sickness tends to come on you. Okay, so you don't own that either, so you can't say, for example, oh, I'm sick today, or I have a headache. You'd have to say, I have a headache on me. Okay, a headache is on me. You wouldn't say, I have. Okay, a headache is on me, is the equivalent. Okay, so at me for things, on me for sickness, and there's other variations which we'll get to eventually. But today we're going to focus on at. Okay, so for example, ha podcast agam, my podcasts. Ha podcast agad, your podcasts. Now, just one little thing before I continue. You might have heard me change the pronunciation of mhac into vac, and that's because the letter H is often inserted after certain vowels in Gaelic. Now, don't worry about that for the moment. We'll get to that. Okay. For example, you might remember in our last podcast, fhuar, it is cold, or literally is it cold. Okay, so it means it is cold, but gle, an H goes in after the F, which makes it silent. That becomes uar. And it's the same with vac, mhac, okay, mo, before it makes it vac, not mhac. And that's because there's an H goes in after the M. and the pronunciation changes to H, changes to V. So for example, Mairi becomes Mhairi, so names change as well. But we'll talk about that another time. Right now, we're going to focus on at. Okay, so ha podcast agam, my podcast. Ha podcast agad, your podcast. Ha podcast aige, his podcast. Ha podcast aige. Ha podcast aige, her podcast. Ha podcast aige, her podcast. Ha podcast againn, our podcast. Ha podcast againn, our podcast. Ha podcast agaibh, your plural podcast. Okay, so ha podcast agaibh, you plural, more than one. Ha podcast aige, ha podcast aige, their podcast. So there we are. That's how we say to have in Gaelic. Okay, so it goes at the end. So, for example, your podcast, a podcast agad. Okay, it sounds very confusing, only because it's new. So you just need to practice it a little bit more. Okay, so when I started, I basically said, "Hello, Matinva, Feskerma is Misha Joseph. Falchegu Gaelic le Joseph. Ha podcast agam. Ha podcast agam. My podcast." Right, that's the hard bit out of the way. Okay, so we're just going to touch on the weather. Last time I was telling you that we create basic sentences with the verb to be, with ha and then the person. So hami fuar, I'm cold. Okay, and that is the basic way you make everything. Okay, Misha is an emphatic version, and if you want to use something to say your name, you don't use the verb to be ha, you would use is. Okay, sometimes you see it written just as an apostrophe, but these days it's written like the English word is, is. So I could say, is Misha Joseph? I wouldn't say Hami Joseph, and I've not actually heard the verb to be using is used other than names. Even for places, if I want to say I'm in Scotland, Hami Ananalaba, I live in Paisley, it would be Hami Fudach. It's actually fluich, but it sounds more like a D. Hami Fudach and fastlich. I hope I said Paisley right there. So it's important just to remember that. Okay, it's important to remember that. So for names is Misha, okay, but for everything else you would use ha, Hami. So Hami fuar, I'm cold. Hashin fuar, we are cold. Hashin cursed, that's right. Hashin cursed. Okay, so if we just talk a little bit more then about this letter H. This letter H, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, okay, but basically if you insert the letter H after the first letter of a word, it's going to change the sound. So if I say aigle, very, aigle, I can't say fhuar anymore because there's an H in there. Okay, so it becomes aigle ur because the F and the H are now silent. Okay. If I want to say it is Mairi, okay, it would be Mairi, okay. But if I'm shouting, "Hey Mary," I would say, "Hello, Mhairi," because there's an H goes in there. So you can see a pattern after E, after some other sounds as well. There's an H suddenly appears after the first letter of the next word. okay? But please, please, please don't worry about that right now. But I'm only telling you this because if we're talking about weather, the H goes in, fhuar becomes ha uar. I don't know where my mind is today. I can see I'm a bit distracted. But anyway, that's a very basic introduction. Okay, so there's a website called learngaelic.scots, and it just loves talking about weather, just like English people. So if you want to learn some more weather, head over to learngaelic.scots and you can try some of their weather exercises, which are in their easiest level of learning Gaelic. Ha fuar, ha fluich is another one. There's loads. You can imagine in the Gaelic world, fluich, wet, features quite a bit. And there we are. That's us for today. So we've been reviewing how to say possession in Gaelic, and we've also been talking about the letter H, and we touched on the weather as well. So go back and review lesson 2, okay, and then come back to this one. All right. Thank you very much. So, Chiri and Drazda, bye for now.